Hey, welcome back to the Astrology of Things. I'm your host and certified astrologer, Sheena, and today I wanted to talk about one of my favorite astrologers and some of the ideas and concepts that inspired me when I came across his work. So, my perspective on astrology really changed the day that I came across Payne Tobey and his teachings about astrology. So I don't remember how I discovered him specifically, but it was definitely a faded a faded day when I came across his works. And I remember that day I specifically looked at the transits, and I know Mars had a factor in it. So I think Mars was either conjunct my midheaven or north node. But I do remember in general that around that time I felt a bit stuck in my astrological studies because I felt some of the things weren't lining up, and I felt things were missing in my studies. And around that time, I felt like I had fallen into a pattern where I was just memorizing keywords and phrases about the zodiac signs and the houses, and not truly grasping and understanding astrology at its core. I felt like I didn't grasp astrology as an entire working dynamic system. And so Tobey's teachings really helped me to see astrology through a mathematic and systematic perspective, which gave me courage to explore how astrology could be applied to other things outside of the human lifespan and its associated biological and psychological components. And I really wish more astrologers would talk about his teachings, and maybe they also aren't aware of him, but I'm grateful to know that some of his former students have continued to pass along his wisdom and the concepts that he taught in astrology. In particular, one that I had the privilege of meeting was Naomi Bennett, who has continued to share and teach his concepts that she's learned from him, and she's even published a lot of his older works so that they are still available for consumption for the current up and coming astrologers. So I wanted to share some of the concepts and ideas that he taught and how they inspired me. So that there are many concepts that he taught. So I'll create separate videos to talk about each different concept or idea that inspired me. So this will probably turn into a mini series. But before I dig into the first idea and concept that inspired me from his work, I did want to bring up his natal chart and point out something specific, because the point of this video is not to do a natal chart analysis. I just wanted to point out a specific thing. So Tobey was born on April 27th, 1902 at 10:32 p.m. in Lynbrook, New York. So he shares his birth data in some of his publications. I forget which one specifically, but yes, I have his chart. So in his chart, I wanted to point out where his Urania is placed. So Urania is an asteroid that represents astrology and astronomy. Now, Urania, well, in ancient times, astrology and astronomy were one in the same. So Urania was like she was one of the muses, and she ruled over astrology and astronomy. So I have a couple shorts on my channel. If you want a quick summary of Urania, and I also have one of Urania in Aries. But I just wanted to point out his Urania is in Aries, and that signifies his thought leadership and his pioneering concepts in the astrology field. So he's really able to pave a way in astrology, and all of which I hope his work will continue throughout time, and hopefully some of the concepts will become popular again and studied and acknowledged. So again, he taught astrology from the perspective that astrology is a mathematical study of biological and psychological dynamics, and that astrology is a higher form of mathematics. He also called it the mathematics of design and the mathematics of life, and also referred to it as a form of abstract science. So today I wanted to touch on one of the things he noted in his book called Astrology Lessons. And in this book, it wasn't a huge thing in his book, but it definitely stood out to me. Not the first time I went through this book, but I commonly refer to this book every now and then, and different things pop out to me as, as I learn astrology and grow in my astrological knowledge, essentially. But in this book, he noted that, and I quote, the solar system is one monstrous atom, and heaven knows what might happen if one of its electrons, planets, was pulled away. So when I came across this in his book, I processed it over time, and really, this analogy of planets to electrons really kind of opened my mind and allowed me to connect this idea to other principles and other visual structures that relate to the idea of electrons versus planets, and solar system versus atomic systems, and astrology and astronomy versus alchemy and chemistry. So one of the principles that I thought of when thinking about the relationship between, or the analogy between, electrons and planets was one of the hermetic principles called the Law of Correspondence. So this principle talks about the understanding of one structure gives way to the secrets of other hidden structures, or structures that are not, yet known or structures that are misunderstood. And from this specific law, the famous quote is derived, which says, "As above, so below, as below, so above." So connecting the dots here helped me see astrology as a higher octave, or rather a metaphysical design that reflected a smaller molecular design, as I held this analogy of the electrons and planets. And seeing astrology as a form of mathematics, this also led me down the thoughts of fractals, which is a mathematical concept where, fractals are described as self-similar patterns that persist across all scales and are known to be reflected commonly in nature's design. So we see fractals everywhere we go. We probably just don't know, but I think the most obvious fractal that we see every day is a tree branches, or a snowflake, for example. And then even thinking further about fractals, this led me into thinking about astrology itself being a fractal, specifically astrology being a time fractal, or a fractal that describes how one moment in time can reflect a larger moment in time, if that makes sense. And as for visual structures, holding the analogy of electrons to planets, it made me think of the visual relationship and similarities between the celestial sphere and the atomic structure. So we may all be familiar with the atomic structure diagram if you've ever taken a chemistry course. And by the way, I loved chemistry in high school. That was one of my favorite subjects. So it's kind of interesting that I see a correlation between chemistry and astrology. But the celestial sphere is a diagram that describes the abstract projected relationship that the celestial bodies have as they orbit the geocentric Earth and intersect abstractly at different points in time to the various Earth divisions that are also projected in this diagram, such as the equator being projected outward, so we can see at what points the projected equator intersects with the sun's pathway, and the sun's pathway is called the ecliptic. So looking at the celestial sphere, we can visually see the correlations that it has to the atomic structure. And so on the right, we see that the atomic structure shows the nucleus at the center. And the nucleus contains the protons and neutrons, while those electrons are orbiting the nucleus. And so, again, this idea of as above, so below. what's reflected on a larger scale is also reflected on a smaller scale. And further, seeing the relationship between astrology and chemistry led me to think about astrology's history. And I forget what book I read this in. I wonder, I might have read it in The Light of Egypt. But somewhere I read that astrology and alchemy were one of the root sciences through which, they were one of the root sciences, and they were considered sister sciences. And from those two sciences, astronomy and chemistry were born. So, from reading that idea of planets, seeing planets as electrons, inspired me and kind of sent me down this rabbit hole of making connections and drawing correlations between different aspects tied to planets and electrons. So, also, thinking about this analogy helped me to see astrology beyond its application to the biological and psychological human dynamics, and really allowed me to branch out and see the value that astrology has in helping to understand other subject matters, and seeing how astrology can be applied to other subjects. All right, so that's all I have for today, and I'll see you in the next one.